Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. One of my favorite scientists on the line with us, Dr. Michael Mann. He is the Distinguished Professor of Meteorology, the Director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University, author of several books. His most recent, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. The inventor of the hockey stick, it just goes on and on. Michael Mann, MANN.net is his website. You can tweet him at Michael E. Mann. Michael, welcome back to the program. Dr. Mann, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Tom. Always great to be with you.
It is great having you with us. There was a piece recently about how a newspaper article about how, in fact, I think it was in the Washington Post, but I could be wrong, about how climate change is related to these severe weather events like we're seeing up and down the East Coast right now as we speak. You and I talked about this a few years ago, and at that point in time, there was a woman, I'm forgetting her name, who I'm not even sure she was a climate scientist, who was suggesting that the change in the differential temperatures between mid-latitudes and Arctic latitudes would weaken the jet stream and would produce, or was producing, these wild weather events. Can you recap that for us, number one, and number two? Let us know, is that now accepted science?
Sure, and I think the individual you're referring to is Jennifer Francis, who is a climate scientist at Rutgers.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, and she's sort of been one of the leading scientists investigating the relationship between what we call Arctic amplification, the fact that there's even more warming up in the Arctic than over the rest of the globe, and that change in the contrast in temperature between the equator and the pole. That's actually what's responsible for the jet stream. So if you change that contrast, you can change the properties of the jet stream. And she has provided a pretty compelling body of work in support of this mechanism where the melting of the Arctic sea ice and the warming of the Arctic is, in fact, changing the behavior of the jet stream. And, in fact, in a sense, it's slowing it down so that we get more stagnant weather patterns. That is to say, when you have an unusual meander in the jet stream associated with rainfall or drought or extremes in temperature, it tends to stick around longer in one area, and that's when you really get extreme weather. That's really when you see extreme weather impacts, when you've got, a pattern where it's raining day after day in one location, or snowing day after day in one location, or the sun is baking that location, and it's basking in heat day after day. That's when you get extreme flooding, extreme drought, extreme wildfires, like we've seen in recent years. And that I would say that hypothesis has evolved from something that was fairly speculative a few years ago to something which increasingly is part of our mainstream understanding of climate science.
Wow. Wow. Which means that as that temperature gradient, that temperature differential continues to deteriorate as a consequence of the Arctic warming so much faster than the rest of the world, we're going to see more and more of this. It's going to get more and more severe. We're going to see more and more, basically polar bomb things.
Right.
Is that the outcome?
Yeah, and so this we sometimes call it a dipole pattern, where it's really warm and dry in the west and really cold in the east, and that happens when you have a particular meandering pattern of the jet stream where it wanders north in the western U.S., bringing warm air from the south, and then it crashes down in the east, bringing all that cold polar Arctic air southward. There is increasing evidence that climate change may be favoring that particular pattern. Now, we've also done some research looking at the impact of Arctic warming on the behavior of the jet stream during the summer. And there are other mechanisms that are at play, because the winter and summer are very different dynamically, meteorologically. And the factors that govern the behavior of weather systems in the winter are quite different from those that govern weather systems in the summer. Well, we've done research suggesting that this amplified Arctic warming is probably also leading to more stagnant summer weather patterns, which means more extreme drought, more extreme flooding, and more extreme wildfire and heat.
Which also means less competent, reliable food production. for humans.
Well, that's right. And the fact is that if you look at some of the projected impacts of climate change on agriculture, often they make fairly simplistic assumptions. For example, that warmer springs and falls will lead to a lengthening of the growing season in sort of extratropical regions like, the breadbasket of North America. But what we're learning as time goes on, that there are other impacts of warming on extreme weather patterns that are likely to have a very deleterious impact on agriculture. So what was once an assumption that we would see more agricultural productivity in mid-latitude regions, increasingly we understand that the possible impact on extreme weather could completely erase or even negate those impacts, and we could actually see detrimental impacts to agriculture, even in regions that we once thought might benefit from warming.
Remarkable. You are. We have about 2.5 minutes left here before we hit a hard break, and you are one of the real heroes of the climate science movement. And the old, I guess it's almost even kind of a, given the state of Native Americans, kind of a racist joke. But you can always tell who the pioneers are. They're the ones with the arrows in their back. You have been the subject of harassment, of lawsuits, of all kinds of stuff. Can you give us a recap on where all that stuff is at?
Sure, yeah, I'm still pulling some of those arrows out. Indeed, if you're out in front communicating the reality and threat of climate change to the public, well, that's inconvenient to the special interests who don't want to see us move away from our addiction to fossil fuels. And so when I published the hockey stick graph back in the late 1990s, and it became sort of this icon, this symbol in the climate change debate, I became an object of attack for those looking to discredit the case for the reality and threat of climate change. And I've come to embrace that role because it's given me an opportunity to inform what I think is, the most interesting and the most important discussion that we're having today, the discussion about what to do about climate change. But, you name it, whether it's being placed in the hot seat at congressional hearings, attacked by congressmen who are funded by fossil fuel interests, receiving threatening substances in the mail, death threats against me, against my family, legal assaults attempting to force me to turn over all my personal emails. I've pretty much been through it all. They've pretty much thrown everything they've got at me, and I'm still standing. I like to think that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and in a sense it's emboldened me in my efforts to communicate the reality and threat of this existential problem, climate change.
And in the 40 seconds we have left, how severe is the threat?
Well, it's growing ever more severe with each passing year, and, it's no longer subtle. As I like to point out, we are seeing the impacts of climate change play out in real time. All you have to do is look at the extremely damaging weather impacts that we've seen here in the U.S. over the last year. Unprecedented superstorms, hurricanes, flooding, record flooding in Houston, unprecedented wildfire, the worst wildfire in California history, and it happened out of season. It happened during what's supposed to be the wet season, the winter. That's never happened before. We are seeing the dangerous impacts of climate change already, and if we continue down this road, things could get a whole lot worse. And so we do have to act, and we have to act now.
Yeah, amen. Dr. Michael Mann, his website, michaelmann, MANN.net. You can tweet him at Michael E. Mann and say hi. Dr. Mann, keep up the great work. You're one of my heroes. Thank you so much for dropping by.
Same here, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks. Great talking with you. Dr. Michael Mann of Penn State University and other fame. We'll be right back. Stick around.